Swann's Way, Combray 2, Part 5, by Marcel Proust. I had heard Bergotte spoken of for the first time by Bloch, a friend older than myself and for whom I had a strong admiration. Hearing me confess my love of the Nuit d'Octobre, he had burst out in a bray of laughter like a bugle call, and told me by way of warning, "You must conquer your vile taste for A. de Musset, Esquire. He is an oddball, one of the very worst, a pretty sinister creature. I am bound to admit, however, that he, and even the man named Racine, did each of them, once in his life, compose a line that is not only fairly rhythmical, but also has what is, in my eyes, the supreme merit of meaning absolutely nothing. One is La Blanche Auluçon et La Blanche Camille, and the other, La Fille de Minot et de Parsifal. They were submitted to my judgment as evidence for the defense of these two ruffians in an article by my very dear master Father Lecomte, who is found pleasing in the sight of the immortal gods. By the way, here's a book that I have not the time just now to read. One recommended, it would seem, by that colossal fellow. He regards, or so they tell me, its author, one Bergotte Esquire, as one of the most subtle oddballs, and albeit he exhibits on occasion an indulgence that is fairly difficult to explain, still his word for me is tantamount to the Delphic oracle. Read, then, this lyrical prose, and if the gigantic assembler of rhythms who composed Bhagavat and La Via de Menu speaks truly, then by Apollo, you may taste, dear master, the ambrosial joys of Olympus. It was in this sarcastic tone that he had asked me to call him, and that he called me dear master, but in reality we found a certain pleasure in this game, since we were still at the age in which one believes that one creates a thing by giving it a name. Unfortunately, I was not able to set at rest by further talks with Bloch, in which I might have insisted on an explanation, the doubts he had engendered in me, which he told me that beautiful lines of poetry from which I expected nothing less than the revelations of truth itself were all the more beautiful if they meant absolutely nothing. For as it happened, Bloch was not invited to the house again. At first, he had been well received. It is true that my grandfather made out that whenever I formed a strong attachment to any of one of my friends and brought him home with me, that friend was invariably a Jew, to which he would not have objected on principle. Indeed, his own friend Swann was of Jewish extraction, had he not found that the Jews whom I chose as friends were not usually of the best type. And so I was hardly ever able to bring a new friend home without my grandfather's humming the O God of our fathers from La Juive, or else Israel break thy chains, singing the tune alone, of course, to an umty-tumty-tum-tra-la. But I used to be afraid of my friends recognizing it, and so being able to reconstruct the words. Before seeing them, merely on hearing their names, about which, as often as not, there was nothing particularly Hebraic, he would divine not only the Jewish origin of such as of my friends as might have been Jewish, but even some dark secret in their family. "And what do they call your friend who is coming this evening?" "Dumont, grandpapa." "Dumont? Oh, I am weary of Dumont." And he would sing, "Archers, be on your guard, watch without rest, without sound." And then, after asking us a few adroit questions on points of detail, he would call out, "On guard, on guard!" Or, if the victim himself had already arrived, Anne had been obliged, unconsciously, by my grandfather's subtle examination, to admit his origin, then my grandfather, to show us that he had no longer any doubts, would merely look on us, humming almost inaudibly. "What do you hither guide the feet of this timid Israelite?" Or, "Of sweet vale of Hebron, dear paternal fields." Or, perhaps, of, "Yes, I am of the chosen race." These little eccentricities on my grandfather's part implied no malice whatsoever toward my friends, but Bloch had displeased my family for other reasons. He had begun by annoying my father, who, seeing him come in with wet clothes, had asked him with keen interest, "Why, Master Bloch, is there a change in the weather? Has it been raining?" "I can't understand it. The barometer indicated fair." He had drawn from Bloch nothing more than this reply: "Sir, I am absolutely incapable of telling you whether it has rained. I live so resolutely apart from physical contingencies that my senses no longer trouble to inform me of them." "My poor boy," said my father after Bloch had gone, "your friend is an idiot." "Why, he couldn't even tell me what the weather is like, as if there could be anything more interesting. He is an imbecile." Next, Bloch had displeased my grandmother because after lunch, when she complained of not feeling very well, he had stifled a sob and wiped the tears from his eyes. "How can he possibly be sincere?" she said to me. "Why, he doesn't even know me, unless he's mad, of course." And finally, he had upset the whole household when he arrived an hour and a half late for lunch, covered with mud from head on foot, and instead of apologizing, said merely, "I never allow myself to be influenced in the smallest degree either by atmospheric disturbances or by the arbitrary divisions of what is known as time. I would willingly reintroduce to society the opium pipe and the Malay Cree, but I am wholly and entirely without instruction in those infinitely more pernicious, besides being quite dully bourgeois, implements, the watch and the umbrella." In spite of all this, he would still have been received at Combray. He was, of course, hardly the friend my parents would have chosen for me. They had in the end decided that the tears which he had shed on hearing of my grandmother's illness were genuine enough. But they knew, either instinctively or from their own experience, that our early impulsive emotions have but little influence over our later actions and the conduct of our lives, and that regard for our moral obligations, loyalty to our friends, patience in finishing our work, obedience to a regimen, have a surer foundation in habits solidly formed and blindly followed than in those momentary transports, ardent and sterile. They would have preferred to Bloch, as companions for myself, boys who would have given me no more than it is proper, by all the laws of middle-class morality, for boys to give one another, who would not unexpectedly send me a basket of fruit, because they happened that morning to have thought of me with affection, but who, being incapable of inclining in my favor by any single impulse of their imagination and sensibility the exact balance of the duties and claims of friendship, were as incapable of loading the scales to my detriment. Even our faults will not easily divert from the path of their duty toward us those conventional natures of which my great aunt was the model, who estranged for years from a niece to whom she never spoke, yet made no change in the will in which she had left that niece the whole of her fortune, because she was the next of kin, and it was her proper thing to do. But I was fond of Bloch. My parents wished me to be happy, and the insoluble problems that I set myself on such texts as the absolute meaningless beauty of La fille lumineuse de Pasiphae tired me more and made me more unwell than would have further talks with him, although my mother judged them pernicious. And he would have still been received at Combray but for one thing. That same night, after dinner, having informed me a piece of news that had a great influence on my later life, making it happier at one time and then more unhappy, that no woman ever thought of anything but love, and that there was not one of them whose resistance a man could not overcome. He had gone on to assure me that he had heard it said on unimpeachable authority that my great-aunt herself had led a stormy life in her youth, and had been notoriously kept. I could not refrain from passing on so important a piece of information to my parents. The next time Bloch called, he was not admitted, and afterward, when I met him in the street, he greeted me with extreme coldness. But in the matter of Bergotte, he had spoken truly. For the first few days, like a tune that one will become mad about, but which one does not at first discern, the things I was to love so passionately in his style were not yet clear to me. I could not lay down the novel of his that I was reading, but I thought that I was interested in the subject alone, as in the first dawn of love when we go every day to meet a woman at some party or entertainment by the delights of which we believe ourselves attracted. Then I observed the rare, almost archaic expressions that he liked to employ at certain points, where a hidden flow of harmony, an internal prelude, would elevate his style. And it was at such points as these, too, that he would begin to speak of the vain dream of life, or of the inexhaustible torrent of fair forms, of the sterile, splendid torture of understanding and loving, of the moving effigies that ennoble for all time the charming and venerable facades of our cathedrals, that he would express a whole system of philosophy, new to me, by the use of marvelous imagery, to the inspiration of which one would have ascribed that song of harps that arose then, and to the accompaniment of which that imagery gave something sublime. One of these passages of Bergotte, the third or fourth that I had detached from the rest, filled me with a joy to which the joy I felt in the first bore no comparison, a joy I felt myself to have experienced in a deeper region of my soul, more indivisible, more vast, from which all obstacles and partitions seemed to have been swept away. For what had happened was that, while I recognized in this passage the same taste for uncommon expressions, the same bursts of music, the same idealist philosophy that had been present in the earlier passages, without my having taken them into account as the source of my pleasure, I now no longer had the impression of being confronted by a particular passage in one of Bergotte's books, which traced on the surface of my mind a purely linear figure, but rather of the ideal passage of Bergotte, common to all his books, and to which all the similar passages, now becoming merged in it, had added a kind of density and volume, by which my own understanding seemed to be enlarged. I was by no means Bergotte's sole admirer. He was the favorite writer also of a friend of my mother's, a highly literary lady. In order to finish Bergotte's latest volume, Dr. du Bourbon had kept all his patients waiting, and it was from his consulting room and from a park near Combray that some of the first seeds were scattered of that predilection for Bergotte, a very rare species in those days, but now so widespread that one finds it flowering everywhere throughout Europe and America, and even in the tiniest villages, a flower both ideal and common. what my mother's friends, and it would seem what Dr. de Bourbon liked above all in the writings of Bergotte, was just what I liked. The same flow of melody, the same old-fashioned phrases, and certain others quite simple and familiar, but so placed by him in such a light as to hint at a particular quality of taste on his part. And also in the sad passages of his books, a sort of roughness, a tone that was almost harsh. And he himself, no doubt, must have felt that these were his principal attractions, for in his later books, if he had come across some great truth or the name of a famous cathedral, he would break off his narrative, and in an invocation, an apostrophe, a lengthy prayer, would give free outlet to that effluence which, in the earlier volumes, remained submerged in his prose, discernible only in a rippling of its surface, and perhaps even more delightful, more harmonious, when it was thus veiled from the eye, when the reader could give no precise indication of where the murmur of the current began, or of where it died away. These passages, which he delighted, were our favorites also. For my own part, I knew all of them by heart. I was disappointed when he resumed the thread of his narrative. Whenever he spoke of something whose beauty had until then remained hidden from me, of pine forests, or of hailstorms, or Notre Dame de Paris, or Atelier, or Phèdre, by some piece of imagery he would make their beauty explode into my consciousness. And so, being aware that the universe contained innumerable elements that my feeble senses would be powerless to discern if he did not bring them within my reach, I wished that I might have his opinion, some metaphor of his on everything, especially on such things as I might have an opportunity some day of seeing for myself. And among such things, particularly on some of the historical moments of France, on certain views of the sea, because the emphasis with which in his books he referred to these showed that he regarded them as rich in significance and beauty. But alas, on almost everything his opinion was unknown to me. I had no doubt that it would differ entirely from my own, since he came from an unknown world toward which I was striving to raise myself. Convinced that my thoughts would have seemed pure ineptitude to that perfected spirit, I had so completely made a clean sweep of them that if I happened to find in one of his books something that had already occurred to me, my heart would swell with gratitude and pride, as though some deity had, in his infinite bounty, restored it to me, had pronounced it to be beautiful and right. It happened now and then that a page of his would say the very same things that I used often at night, when I was unable to sleep, to write to my grandmother and mother, and so concisely and well that Bergotte's page had the appearance of a collection of epigraphs for me, to set at the head of my letters. And so, too, in later years, when I began to compose a book of my own, and the quality of some of my sentences seemed so inadequate that I could not make up my mind to go on with the undertaking, I would find the equivalent of my sentences in Bergotte. But it was only then, when I read them in his work, that I could enjoy them. When it was I myself who composed them, in my anxiety that they should exactly reproduce what I perceived in my mind, and in my fear of their not turning out true to life, I had more than enough time to ask myself whether what I was writing would be pleasant to read. But in reality, there was no kind of language, no kind of ideas that I really liked, except these. My anxious and unsatisfactory attempts were themselves a token of my love, a love without pleasure, but profound. And so, when I came suddenly upon similar phrases in the writings of another, and was thus free from scruples, from strictness, and having no need to torment myself, I indulged to the full my own appetite for such phrases, just as a cook, who for once has no dinner to prepare for others, finds at last the time to be a gourmand himself. One day, having found in a book by Bergotte some joke about an old family servant, to which the writer's solemn and magnificent style added a great deal of irony, but which was what I had often said to my grandmother about Françoise, and when another time I had discovered that he thought not unworthy of reflection in one of those mirrors of truth that were his writings, a remark similar to one I had occasion to make about Monsieur Legrandin, and moreover, my remarks on Françoise and Monsieur Legrandin were among those that I would most resolutely have sacrificed for Bergotte's sake, in the belief that he would find them quite without interest. Then it suddenly seemed to me that my own humble existence and the realms of truth were less widely separated than I had supposed, that at certain points they actually coincided, and in my newfound confidence and joy I wept on the writer's pages, as in the arms of a long-lost father. From his books I had formed an impression of Bergotte as a frail, and disappointed old man who lost his children and had never found any consolation. And so as I read, I would sing his prose in my mind, with more dolce, more lento than he himself had perhaps intended, and his simplest phrase would strike my ears with a tender intonation. More than anything else, I loved his philosophy, and had pledged myself to it in lifelong devotion. It made me impatient to reach the age when I would be eligible to attend the class at school called philosophy. But all I wanted to do there was simply to exist and be entirely guided by the mind of Bergotte. And if I had been told then that the metaphysicians whom I was actually to follow there resembled him in nothing, I would have felt the despair a young lover feels who has sworn lifelong fidelity when a friend speaks to him of the other mistresses he will have in time to come. One Sunday, while I was reading in the garden, I was interrupted by Swann, who had come to call on my parents. "What are you reading? May I look?" "Why, it's Bergotte. Who has been telling you about him?" "It's an astonishing likeness. He has the same arched eyebrows and hooked nose and prominent cheekbones. When his beard comes, he'll be Mahomet himself. Anyhow, he has good taste, for Bergotte is a charming creature." And seeing how much I seemed to admire Bergotte, Swann, who never spoke at all about the people he knew, made an exception in my favor and said, "I know him well. If you would like him to write a few words on the title page of your book, I could ask him for you." I dared not accept such an offer, but bombarded Swann with questions about Bergotte. "Can you tell me, please, who is his favorite actor?" "Actor? No, I can't say, but I do know this. There's not a man on the stage whom he thinks equal to Burma. He puts her above everyone. Have you seen her?" "No, sir. My parents do not allow me to go to the theater." That is a pity. You should insist. Burma and Phèdre In the Cid? Well, she's only an actress, if you will, but you know that I don't believe very much in the hierarchy of the arts. As he spoke, I noticed what had often struck me before in his conversations with my grandmother's sisters, that whenever he spoke of serious matters, whenever he used an expression that seemed to imply a definite opinion on some important subject, he would take care to isolate it by using a special intonation, mechanical and ironic, as though he had put the phrase or word in quotation marks and was anxious to disclaim any personal responsibility for it, and say the hierarchy, don't you know, as silly people call it. But then, if it was so absurd, why did he say the hierarchy? A moment later he went on. Her acting will give you as noble a vision as any masterpiece of art, as, oh, I don't know. And he began to laugh. Shall we say the Queen of Chartres? Until then, I had supposed that his horror of having to give a serious opinion was something Parisian and refined, in contrast to the provincial dogmatism of my grandmother's sisters. And I had suspected also that it was characteristic of the attitude toward life of the circle in which Swann moved, where, by a natural reaction from the lyrical enthusiasm of earlier generations, an excessive importance was given to a small, precise facts, formerly regarded as vulgar, and anything in the nature of phrase-making was banned. But now I found myself slightly shocked by Swann's attitude when confronted with things. He appeared unwilling to risk even having an opinion, and to be at his ease only when he could furnish with meticulous accuracy precise details. But in so doing, he did not take into account that even here he was giving an opinion, postulating that the accuracy of his details had an importance of its own. I thought again of dinner that night, when I had been so unhappy, because Mamma would not be coming up to my room. And when he had dismissed the balls given by the Princess de Leon as being of no importance, and yet it was to just that sort of amusement that he was devoting his life, I found all this contradictory. For what other kind of existence did he reserve the duties of saying in all seriousness what he thought about things, of formulating judgments that he would not put in quotation marks? And when would he cease to give himself up with a fastidious politeness to occupations that at the same time he freely admitted are absurd? I noticed, too, in the manner in which Swann spoke to me of Bergotte, something that, to do him justice, was not peculiar to himself, but was shared by all that writer's admirers at that time, by my mother's friend, and by Dr. Dubonnet. Like Swann, they would say of Bergotte, he has a charming mind, so individual. He has a way of his own, of saying things, a little affected but so pleasant. You never need to look for his name on the title page. You can tell his work at once. But none of them had yet gone so far as to say, he is a great writer, he has great talent. They did not even credit him with talent at all. They did not say so because they were not aware of it. We are all very slow in recognizing in the particular physiognomy of a new writer the model that is labeled great talent in our museum of general ideas. Precisely because that physiognomy is new, we find in it no resemblance to what we are accustomed to call talent. We say rather originality, charm, delicacy, strength. And then, one day we realize that all this is precisely what constitutes talent. Are there any books in which Bergotte has written about Burma? I asked M. Swann. I think he has, in that little book on Racine, but it must be out of print. Still, there has perhaps been a second printing. I will find out. Anyhow, I can ask Bergot himself all that you want to know next time he comes to dine with us. He never misses a week, from one year's end to another. He is my daughter's greatest friend. They go about together and look at old towns and cathedrals and castles. As I was completely ignorant of the different grades in the social hierarchy, the fact that my father found it impossible for us to see anything of Swann's wife and daughter had for a long time the contrary effect of making me imagine them as separated from us by an enormous gulf, which greatly enhanced their dignity and importance in my eyes. I was sorry that my mother did not dye her hair and redden her lips, as I had heard our neighbor Madame Sazerat say that Madame Swann did, to gratify not her husband but Monsieur de Choiseul, and I felt that to her we must be an object of scorn, which distressed me particularly on account of Mademoiselle Swann, such a pretty little girl, as I had heard, and one of whom I used often to dream, always imagining her with the same arbitrary and charming features. But from this afternoon, when I had learned that Mademoiselle Swann was so rare a creature, bathed as in her natural element, in such a sea of privilege, that if she were to ask her parents whether anyone were coming to dinner, she would be answered in those 2 syllables, radiant with light, would hear the name of that golden guest, who was to her no more than an old friend of the family, Bergot. That for her, the intimate conversation at table, corresponding to what my great-aunt's conversation was for me, would be the words of Bergot on all those subjects that he had not been able to take up in his books, and on which I would have liked to hear him utter oracles, and that above all, when she went to visit other towns, he would be walking by her side, unrecognized and glorious, like the ancient gods who used to descend to dwell among mortal men. Then I realized both the rare worth of a creature such as Mademoiselle Swann, and at the same time how coarse and ignorant I would appear to her. And I felt so keenly how pleasant and yet how impossible it would be for me to become her friend that I was filled at once with longing and with despair. And usually from this time forth, when I thought of her, I would see her standing before the porch of a cathedral, explaining to me what each of the statues meant, and with a smile that was my highest commendation, presenting me as her friend to Bergot. And invariably, the charm of all the ideas that cathedrals used to inspire in me, the charm of the hills, of the Ile-de-France, and of the plains of Normandy, would spread its reflections over the pictures I had formed in my mind of Mademoiselle Swann. Nothing more remained but to know and to love her. Once we believe that a person has a share in some unknown existence to which his or her love can win us admission, that is, of all the preliminary conditions that love exacts, the one to which it attaches most importance, the one that makes him indifferent as to the rest. Even those women who pretend that they judge a man by his exterior only see in that exterior an emanation from some special way of life, and that is why they fall in love with a soldier or a fireman whose uniform makes them less particular about his face. They kiss and believe that beneath the crushing breastplate there beats a heart different from the rest, more adventurous, more tender, and a young king or a crown prince may travel in foreign countries and make the most gratifying conquests, and yet lack entirely that regular and classic profile that would be indispensable, perhaps, in a stockbroker.